It's Europe's biggest conflict since World War II, and today we go inside Ukraine. The estimates of just how many people have been killed in the 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine vary. But one thing is undeniable. Whichever data point you use, the death toll is huge. Ukraine has put its official losses at 55,000 soldiers, and the BBC has verified more than 180,000 on the Russian side. In addition to that, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. Millions have fled. This week marks 4 years since the start of the conflict. And we're joined by the BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen. He's been speaking to soldiers, civilians, and even Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelensky, about whether peace is possible. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid, and welcome to The Global Story on YouTube. Jeremy, you've spent the past few weeks traveling around Ukraine, talking to people who've been living through this war for 4 years now. Where did you start your journey?
We've seen quite a bit of the country. We started off in Lviv in western Ukraine, drove in there from Poland, which is the way in, because, of course, because of the war, you can't fly. We filmed in a very large cemetery, which is now full. Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of flags there on all the graves. So they're operating
And largely soldiers,
site.
Those graves, or are those civilians as well?
Mostly
soldiers.
I've also, after a very long car journey, this is a big country and the roads are long, we spent a week or so in eastern Ukraine, working out of Kharkiv and going down to Donetsk, which is it's probably the area with the most intense fighting going on right now. When you travel through the areas which are within drone range of the Russian side, increasingly all the vulnerable roads are being netted. So what this means is they put up poles which are about 20 feet high, and the netting makes the road into a tunnel, if you like. And the idea is that if it gets attacked by one of these explosive drones, they're called FPV drones, first person view, which means they have cameras on them, they are directed. There's a lot of really scary video online of these drones actually sometimes chasing individuals, chasing cars, blowing them up, killing them, destroying things. So the idea of the nets is that if the drones try to attack a vehicle on the road, then their rotors will get caught up in the netting, and it's a pretty cheap and effective defense. Quite a lot of the netting has been donated by fishermen in Scotland, in France.
It's
in Norway,
made
and
of fishnet material. That's what it's made of.
Some of it
fascinating
is sort of pensioned off fishing nets.
And so as you're driving around, you would see this netting. And did you all happen to drive under some of it? You said it's to protect.
Yeah, we were for
vehicles.
miles, and all of that is to try to outwit these, fiendish weapons, which, and I've seen on previous trips as well, an expertly piloted drone with a small charge of explosive on it, and the whole thing probably costing about $1,000, can, in the hands of a skilled pilot, destroy a tank that costs maybe $20 or $30 million.
I mean, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about this type of material being used as a primary defense mechanism. And here we are in the year 2026, Jeremy. I want to put listeners in a bit of context here. You mentioned spending some time out in the East. Russia now occupies about 20% of Ukraine, largely in the east of the country, in the Donbas region, where the fighting has been focused on for the last several years. What is life like for people in the cities and towns on the front line? I know, Jeremy, you spent time there on the front line, reporting and meeting with people in some of those frontline towns.
Yeah, we went to a town in Donetsk. The Ukrainians still control 20% of Donetsk. Now, in that 20% is several fortified towns on higher ground, and one of them we went to, which is called Slavyansk. And of course, you go down the netted roads to get there. You drive in through a lot of wreckage, which has happened over the years of the war. And it's a town which just about functions. There are shops open, there are some little supermarkets, there are a few coffee places, but the streets are pretty empty because a lot of people have left. It's dangerous. The issue there is, again, drones. So when people go out, if they have to do some shopping, something like that, or if they have a job to go to, you see them hurrying down the road. People don't like to hang around in the open because it's dangerous, and it certainly felt, you feel exposed when you're there.
Can you tell us about some of the people that you met?
First of all, a remarkable, he's actually a Christian minister, a man, a sort of beefy middle-aged guy called Olya, who runs his own relief operation, and he goes to really dangerous spots, outlying villages where only the military normally go. And he has set up a bakery, which is in this really destroyed industrial area, but it's the one building seemingly still functional. And you go inside, outside it's cold, there's snow, there's ice, there's just destruction. You go into this place, it's clean, it's warm, quite welcoming, smell of bread.
And he's still baking things. He's able to still bake in the midst of all this.
And it's industrial, it's not artisanal. It's he produces 17,000 loaves a week.
Wow.
And he takes them out. He's got an armored delivery vehicle, an SUV, and he drives off to outlying villages with an SUV full of bread. And there sometimes he brings out people who want to be evacuated. And he said to me, look, things got much worse in the last few months in Donetsk. And I also asked him, as I asked everybody I met there, about the demands being made by Russia's President Putin, which have had some support from Donald Trump and his people. One of Putin's main demands is that this 20% of Donetsk and some other territory elsewhere further south is basically given up, that the Ukrainians just pull out of it. He said, I've raised my family here, I come from here. Why should we just give it to him, give it to this guy? You give the thief a prize. Words to that effect.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about then what the current situation looks like for Ukraine. We've seen Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's been holding talks with the United States, notably with Steve Witkoff, who's one of President Trump's top advisors, as well as, also talking with European leaders. It appears that they've been trying to hammer out an end to this war. But despite these talks, where we are, at least as of now, is that the last round of talks earlier this month did not lead to any breakthroughs. And so here we are 4 years into this war. And Jeremy, where does that leave Ukraine? What is the status of Ukraine at this moment?
Well, yeah, the talks, both sides, both Russians and Ukrainians, said they were difficult, which I think is diplomatic speak for they didn't make any progress on the big issues. They made some progress on minor ones. They said, details about how perhaps a ceasefire might work if there was a ceasefire, but getting to the ceasefire is the hard bit. Look, I think the Americans keep trying to impose a deadline. One thing that has been said here, and Zelensky was talking about in a briefing, he was told by the Americans, he says, that they wanted to wrap this up by the summer because then the
midterm
US
elections
wants to concentrate on the midterms.
Yes.
So, from a Ukrainian perspective, tying their war effort to the US political timetable just sounds like insanity, and they won't do it. And I think the fact that the US side keeps trying to impose deadlines and they don't get anywhere with them, it's testimony to the limitations on the leverage they have on both sides. And they do Trump himself tends to default to putting pressure on Zelensky of Ukraine rather than Putin of Russia. And Putin has been quite open about this. He doesn't think there should be an independent Ukraine. He thinks Ukraine should be, if not absolutely part of Russia, very much in its orbit. And of course, that was the case for a long period in the Soviet period, and in the Russian Empire before that. And they had some very, very bad experiences with Moscow, and they do not want to repeat them.
Jeremy, you mentioned a moment ago that Ukrainians see this as an existential struggle. Is there nonetheless any sense of war fatigue after 4 years of fighting now?
Of course, inevitably. There have been tens of thousands killed. The Ukrainians have talked about maybe 55,000 casualties minimum. Zelensky mentioned that number, but even he said it's an underestimate.
Meaning it's likely much higher than the 55,000.
Yeah, but they only count the bodies that they collect and identify.
Okay.
And there are an awful lot of missing soldiers. The Russians, the BBC has counted just over 180,000 verified names by going through local records, obituaries, and so on of dead Russian soldiers. But again, that is considered to be an underestimate. So you're talking about a lot of dead people. That has had a devastating effect on families. There are tens of thousands, particularly of military veterans, mostly youngish men, who have lost limbs and have other, horrendous injuries, life-changing injuries, which they, will have to adapt to live the rest of their lives. I spoke to one soldier who'd spent more than 100 days in his position. And because it's really difficult and dangerous to relieve people, they often don't have rotations that they would want. So he was stuck, basically, he said, with his squad in a 6-meter deep hole, dugout on the front line. He was stuck there for more than 100 days, and he only got out because he volunteered to take out 2 wounded. Now, on the way out to the rear areas, their vehicle was struck. One of the wounded guys was killed along with the drivers. Another vehicle picked them up. They drove over a landmine, but he got out and one of the wounded guys got out. And then the news came back from his original position was that it had been overrun and his comrades left behind were either missing or dead. So that's how he's alive today. But for those people who are in uniform and are fighting, there seems to be a kind of grim determination, I suppose you'd say, to keep on going. And of course they get tired, they've had enough. That's why they need new recruits, and they're struggling to get as many as they need.
It sounds like there's a determination on behalf of the soldiers, but what about the civilians? I mean, this war has taken a toll on many civilians as well. Is there this similar sense of need to continue and belief that you ought to continue? I mean, I just wonder what the morale is like for people who aren't necessarily at the front lines, who aren't soldiers.
The opinion polls suggest that essentially people feel they don't have a choice. Yeah, they don't basically want to turn the clock back. And that's something that Putin wants to do, because he feels that if he wants to rebuild the power, the global power that the Soviet Union had, and this appears to be his objective, he's written long articles coming out with all sorts of historical justifications for the things that they do, saying essentially that these people are Russians. They should be Russian. They should be part of Russia. And that's something that Ukrainians don't agree with.
As you know, Jeremy, our show is about where the world and America meet. And in the minds of many Americans, Ukraine's resistance to Russia has become somewhat synonymous with its wartime president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who I know you met on this trip there reporting in Ukraine. He has come to Washington multiple times over the course of this conflict, meeting first with President Biden and now more recently with President Trump, pleading with members of Congress and frankly, even at times with the American public to continue to support this war. You went to interview him at his government headquarters there in Kyiv. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, you go to interview any national leader, head of state, there's going to be security, and there's a war going on here, and he has been the subject of assassination attempts, so he lives behind a great deal of security. The governmental quarter in Kyiv is in a residential district, quite well to do, and people still live inside the security cordon, if you like, but it's very, very heavily guarded. Zelensky himself, I interviewed him actually a year ago, just after his, infamous shouting match with Messrs. Trump and Vance in the Oval Office. And he was then and now, I think, remarkably resilient.
Some people, I think including President Trump, say Ukraine cannot win this war. Are they correct?
Where are you now? Today you're in Kyiv. You're in the capital of our homeland. You are in Ukraine. I'm grateful for this. Will we lose? Of course not, because we are fighting for Ukraine's independence.
I actually said to him, look, how much longer can you continue doing this? He said, I've got energy. I still have energy with all of this. If you think back to the very beginning, 4 years ago, when the full-scale invasion was launched, he did a very famous, went massively viral video where he stood out in front of the official presidential buildings here in the city with his leading advisors behind him. And he basically said, it was a selfie video. He said, look, we're all here. We are here. And at the time, the Russians were saying that they were all trying to get out of the country. He said, we're here. You know, my chief of staff is here. The generals are here. Everyone's here. And we're going to resist. We're going to fight. Look, I think just tangibly looking at the evidence, the level of support that Ukraine gets from the United States compared to how it got at the height of the help it was getting from Joe Biden, it gets way, way less, way less. There have been credible sounding reports, not least in the New York Times, about deals in the Wall Street Journal, deals that are waiting to be done, we're told, between American businessmen and Russian businesses when and if they can get to a ceasefire and somehow bring Russia back in from the cold. So the evidence is that the US is a highly conditional ally.
Because the Trump administration has essentially stopped a lot of military aid, most of it, right, to Ukraine, there was an assumption that this would in some ways change the calculus of what was going on the battlefield. I mean, I understand that the United States continues to sell military aid to the Europeans, to NATO. There are other mechanisms through which some of this aid is getting through. But you describe a situation on the ground of a very active war in which the Ukrainians are not really on the back foot. And that, to me, is a curiosity, given the expectation that if the U.S. stopped this direct military aid, suddenly it was going to put Ukraine in a really, really dire situation. How do you make sense of that?
The things the U.S. provides, which the Ukrainians really can't do without, are the things that the Europeans can't provide, which is mostly Patriot batteries, anti-missile batteries and interceptors, and some of the long-range artillery and strike equipment as well. But the other thing to remember about the Ukrainians is, you know, this is not like the US military supporting, if you like, the Iraqi army or, you know, pre-Taliban takeover, the Afghan army. You know, this was a military that was organized, had a tradition of operating quite sophisticated Soviet-era weapons systems. You know, it's a technologically advanced country. They have a high-tech sector. They had an aerospace sector. They built the largest aircraft in the world, not very far from here. So, you know, this is a country which as well has, in the last 4 years, has done extraordinary things developing its own weapons, particularly drones, not just drones that fly through the air, drones, naval drones, which have essentially, the Ukrainians didn't have a navy. So instead of trying to build ships, they built naval drones, which have sunk a lot of Russian ships and forced the Russians to move their navy away from the Ukrainian coast in the Black Sea. As well as that, they have developed ground-based autonomous vehicles, drones, if you like, land drones. So, you know, they have developed these things themselves. So I think the point is the point I'm trying to make is that there was a military-industrial complex here, in fact, in Soviet times in Ukraine. And they are trying to get that going again with some success.
You've described what the situation is amongst the civilian population, amongst soldiers, amongst, you know, the political leadership with Zelensky. So as a whole, Jeremy, how would you say that 4 years of war have changed Ukraine?
Massively. War changes countries. It changes the way they look at the world. It changes the way they assess their friends and their enemies. There's been a huge exodus of people. There are several million Ukrainians abroad as refugees. The longer this goes on and they establish their lives elsewhere, you know, principally in Europe, they might be reluctant to come back, particularly if there's uncertainty about the future. People here talk about a huge demographic crisis. The population is falling. I mean, Ukraine is physically a big country, but its population was in the low 40s million before the war. It's less than that now. And they, sure, I mean, they've had a real bruising, more than that, in the last 4 years. And one thing I would say is that while I don't see any sign that Ukraine is about to collapse, some analysts say that, I don't buy that. I also see no sign that this war is going to end anytime soon. And that's pretty dismal for the people who are engaged in it, because war is exhausting. It takes over lives, it ends lives, and it causes immense destruction, with consequences actually certainly felt across the European continent, this war and beyond.
Well, Jeremy, thank you for bringing your reporting and sharing it to us, particularly in the midst of being there on the road in Kyiv. We appreciate it.
Not at all. Thank you.
That's it for the Global Story today on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. And by the way, if you enjoyed our episode, I want to recommend checking out our podcast. You can find the Global Story as a podcast every weekday, wherever you listen to your favorite shows. We'll talk to you again soon.